I honestly feel misled by this game. When I first saw preview images of it, I imagined that it'd be a fast-paced FPS based around horror and gore. Once I actually started playing, I realized that due to the amount of sneaking around that was required, what I'd be getting was something more than a walking simulator and less than a typical FPS. To some, labeling an FPS as typical would be an insult, but seeing as how this game doesn't reach that level, it'd be lucky if it were referred in such a way. I realize that this is an early access game, so you might as well consider it a work in progress, but it's still incredibly rough, buggy, and at times has prevented me from being able to move forward. It was frustrating having to repeat sections over and over again because the game wasn't responding in the way that it should have. It was to the point where I wanted to stop playing and move on to another game, but I wanted to see everything that the game had to offer, and also so that I could competently write about it. Having played through what it currently has to offer, I feel confident in being able to write about this game. From the start, I thought it was nice that it featured multiple different difficulty settings. I pretty much always go straight for normal, but if I see that normal is too easy, or it's the kind of game where I'm really good, I'll bump it up a notch to deal with an enjoyable challenge. Seeing as how I didn't try the other difficulty settings that DowntheDead has to offer, I don't know how they differ from normal. What I do know is that if normal is a sign of what the other difficulty settings would have to offer, they'd be harder to deal with simply due to being unable to properly play this game. With DowntheDead, its problems go beyond something like the tutorial sections feeling a bit intrusive. I'll eventually get into all of that, but for now, I'd like to discuss the game's help options. For the most part, I'd say that I don't have a problem with tutorials or other forms of help from a game as I'm playing, but I don't want that to get in the way of my enjoyment. Some games will get around that problem by masking what you're doing as simply being part of the game, and some others will make it clear that you'll be dealing with tutorials/practice runs before getting into the real meat and potatoes of the game. With DowntheDead, it was neither of those options. Instead, what it offers is a bothersome and intrusive way of letting you know how to approach certain things found within the game. I thought it was annoying that I'd be playing and they'd pop out of nowhere. It bothered me because rather than offering an experience that freely flowed and allowed me to feel in control of what was going on, it was like having someone regularly interrupting me while I try to speak. Thankfully, this didn't last beyond the first 10 to 15 minutes of Chapter 1, but even for that amount of time it was still annoying to deal with. I went into playing DowntheDead with hopeful expectations. It's not only because its preview images look good, but also because I generally try to see the good in just about every game I play. Even if a game turns out to be absolute garbage, I want to find at least one thing that's worth praising. I guess that's why I started to think that this game would be influenced by Half-Life, mainly due to the game's first available weapon being a crowbar. I realize that many games feature crowbars, but with how influential Half-Life is and with the amount of time that's passed since it was released, chances are that a game featuring a crowbar as a melee weapon isn't just a coincidence. With that in mind, I'd eventually be disappointed not only because I couldn't break open crates that I'd encounter, but also because DowntheDead failed in ways that a near 24-year-old game didn't. What I'm getting at is that it would have been nice to have been able to continuously use the crowbar instead of getting one hit per click. Seeing as how so much of the early game relies on you using the crowbar, its flaws were very clear to me, and that led to combat feeling clunky. It's because there was a bit of a delay between you clicking on the mouse and the striking animation occurring. To be a bit more specific, it's really more of a cooldown period, but either way, it didn't feel as smooth as it could have been. You could say that this was done to fall in line with how other parts of the game rely on the stamina system, but with how things turned out, the combat at times felt like a turn-based RPG, but in an FPS game. Don't get me wrong, I love RPGs, but if I'm playing an FPS and there's a delay between what I'm trying to do, I'm not going to be a happy camper. I'm sure that some could respond to that and say something like, well, how come you love the modern Fallout games despite them featuring the VATS system? The difference between how combat was approached in those games and in this one is that it's just one of multiple different ways that combat could be approached. Even if you decide to rely on VATS, the speed in which your actions play out match with the system that's been made available. In DowntheDead, it just feels slow for all the wrong reasons. Whenever I was attempting to take down an enemy with a crowbar, it was as if we each had to take turns attacking each other. It's not as if I was dealing with an enemy at each corner, but it happened enough times to leave me feeling how I do. The problem is that these clunky encounters would eventually add up, and it made it difficult to get through the game. It's not because it was hard, but because simply trying to play was difficult. You quickly realize that there's a hierarchy when it comes to the enemies featured in this game. There are some enemies that should be avoided at all costs, mainly because a hit from them would lead to an instant death, but there are also regular enemies that could be brought down. Towards the middle of those two were some that were simply tougher than the average enemy. They could be taken down, but it required more effort than was necessary for the basic zombies found in this game. Not only was it problematic because it made dealing with those enemies a bit more difficult, but also because I was having to deal with harder enemies while also having to make do with a clunky system that left me feeling as if my desired actions weren't properly conveyed. Simply put, there was a bit of a disconnect between what I wanted to do as a player and what the in-game character would do. At other times, it was seen that there were other problems when it came to encountering enemies. I thought it was strange how even in groups only a single enemy would respond to being attacked from afar. That stood out to me because if you happen to run through a group of them, they'd all chase after you. You could say that it's a viable tactic to try to pick off enemies one at a time, especially since you're so vulnerable against them, but it came off as a flaw of the game rather than as a favorable feature. Even after I found the pistol and moved on from the crowbar, I was having to play more cautiously than I would have liked. On the bright side, I thought that the hand/arm design looked good whenever you happened to be wielding the pistol. It didn't look ultra realistic, but at the same time, it didn't look bad. I'd say that it was the good kind of different, and I liked that. Besides the issues I've been discussing so far, I was also unsatisfied with the game's inventory system. I thought that it was too basic, and it felt as if it belonged in a game from the 90s. I say that, and yet I know that there are other 90s FPS games out there that did a better job with their inventory system. What I mean is that it would have been nice to have been able to switch through weapons with the mouse's scroll wheel. Instead, I'd have to click 1 to 3 to switch between the crowbar, flashlight, and pistol. It's not as if this added a great amount of time to the point where it took too long, but it still bothered me because I know that things could have been better. In general, the inventory system required a bit too much work on your part. You can regularly pick up batteries, medkits, and ammo, but you constantly have to open the menu, press the resort button, and make space that way. If that doesn't work, mainly due to having too many items, you could drop items, use medkits when they really weren't necessary, or reload the pistol/battery. The option for things to be done automatically was partially there, but it's not to the point that I would have liked. It required too much work on your part, and that got in the way of you actually engaging with the more fun elements of this game. This is more of a nitpick than a legitimate complaint, but I figure it's worth noting because it gives you an idea of how things are in this game. Pretty much every time you killed an enemy, you had the chance to search them for items. Sometimes you'd find something, but other times you'd get nothing. The problem was that sometimes I'd search a body, it'd say that my inventory was full, so my next step would be to rearrange my inventory. The issue was the fact that I'd go through all that trouble to see what I'd be able to get from a dead enemy, only to find out that there was nothing to be found. This was an example of how things generally worked in this game. Rather than trying to make things user-friendly, you'd end up having to put in extra effort only to realize that it was a complete waste of time. Even when I found parts of the game that were worth praising, there was still plenty done to leave me thinking that things could have been improved. It's clear that this is a horror/gore-based game, and as a result of that, it's fitting that it feature ominous music. To some, this was probably too much, seeing as how the music kept playing over and over again, but it was even worse when there'd be a huge shift between the regular background music that plays for the majority of time versus the music that plays when you're engaged in combat. There really was no easing into that, and it made the drastic shifts stand out for negative reasons. A good example of properly doing this could be seen in Final Fantasy VII. Even if there's a difference between the overworld music or the music in whichever area you happen to be in, the sound effect that plays just as a battle is soon to begin works as a buffer between the music that was just playing and the music that's about to begin. For the most part, some of the areas in this game looked really bare. The bathrooms/patient rooms looked much better, but there was too big of a difference between the areas where you'd spend most of the time versus the ones that you'd pop into every once in a while. A specific example of how plain some of the areas looked was when you were forced to navigate through a vent system. Not only did it look really plain, but it featured a lot of twists and turns, which led to prolonging this section of the game. Even if the option to make the vent system look better wasn't there, for one reason or another, at least it could have been made shorter so as to not force players to deal with something that was both irritating to look at and frustrating to navigate through. This would continue to be seen in the general areas of the game thanks to an ever-present gray haze. You could avoid having to look at it by using the flashlight, but the problem was that it'd start to run out, so you'd want to conserve its battery power as much as you could. That reminded me of Doom 3, but not in a good way. I want to say that the gray haze featured in Chapter 1 was meant to create an atmosphere, but what it does is mask pretty bare-looking areas. What immediately came to mind was that it was kind of like being in Silent Hill, but in a bad kind of way. With Silent Hill, the game's appearance was due to the PlayStation 1's system limitations, but Team Silent were able to use that to their advantage. With DowntheDead, It just came off as a cheap way of trying to keep players on edge, but in reality, it was frustrating to deal with. An interesting part of DowntheDead is the fact that it features zombie vision. I'm sure that this ability is directly related to the events playing out in the game's story, and that can occasionally be seen via its documents. It was cool being able to use the zombie vision as a way to better navigate through the level, but I felt that it was way too easy to use it and know where to go. The fact that your stamina decreases while you use it means it's not meant to be used all the time, but it still makes things easier than it should. If it were up to me, I would have just left it so that the zombie vision was a way to detect enemies and not as a way to orient yourself. The level design in both chapters would have to be tightened up a bit to make this a smooth experience, but it beats more or less knowing where you have to go thanks to using zombie vision. By this point in this review, I've discussed plenty of what stood out to me for negative reasons. Unfortunately, I still plan on continuing to do so because DowntheDead had other issues besides how some of its mechanics came off. It's possible that some of the bugs that I encountered were due to the fact that this is an early access game, and it could be considered a work in progress, but it was still frustrating to know that there were parts where I struggled to advance. It wasn't due to me lacking the necessary abilities to advance through the game, but because there were moments where bugs and other similar issues kept me from moving ahead. At one point in Chapter 1, I was being chased by a high-level monster that quickly got through me as if I were nothing. The point of the situation wasn't to confront this enemy, but to run away and escape from the area. This was only possible by reaching the end of a hallway and pushing a gurney away from a door. For some reason, I wasn't able to do this despite the fact that I had previously been able to move boxes and perform other maneuvers besides simply walking or running. It took me like 4 attempts to be able to move on from that section, and that left me feeling annoyed. Similar issues would continue, but this time it involved not being able to reload or fire the pistol after I had reloaded into a chapter. This was especially problematic because this is an FPS game, but also because I regularly encountered enemies that I could have easily taken care of, but the pistol just wouldn't reload or fire. On top of that, there were also moments in which the game wouldn't stop loading. This usually happened after I was killed, and the loading took so long that I occasionally had to force a shutdown. I know that this wasn't caused by my computer and its hardware because this wasn't a frequent occurrence. It didn't happen frequently, but it still left me with a negative opinion of this game because it's clear that it requires a lot of work to be done in order for it to offer a decent and hopefully enjoyable experience. As if the loading issues and not being able to reload or fire the pistol wasn't enough, sometimes I'd reload into a part of the level I happened to be on only to see enemies I previously killed just standing there and doing nothing. You'd think that this wasn't that big of a deal because it's not as if they were attacking me or forcing me to waste ammo on them, but I still thought that this reflected poorly of the game. Since this is currently an early access game, it only featured 2 playable chapters. I thought that Chapter 1 felt like it really didn't know what it wanted to be. It featured too much variety, and it left me thinking that it didn't know whether to focus on its stealth elements or what you'd come to expect from a more typical FPS. On the bright side, I felt that Chapter 2 was better organized. It was smaller, concise, and it was more action-heavy. Chapter 1 required way too much sneaking around, and I didn't come into this game expecting that. If anything, I thought it was inappropriate due to how the game made itself come off from the preview images I saw of it. I praised Chapter 2, and yet it's likely that being action-heavy is one of the reasons why it had the issues that it did. Once I had beaten both of the chapters, I felt that I had seen enough to be able to fully express my thoughts in regards to DowntheDead. Unfortunately, I don't think this is a game worth playing. If the current version is a sign of what's to come once it's been fully released, this will be a game to avoid. At the same time, part of me thinks that some or many of the issues I had with it were due to the fact that this is an early access game. It really depends on the developer and what they're willing to include or not include in an early access game, but you'd think that the point is to try to deliver the best possible experience before it's fully released. Part of me wants to say that things could be better once this game is complete, but if what it currently has to offer is a sample of what's to come, I'm not interested in giving the full game a try. This is the kind of game you want to avoid not only because it features a lot of issues that make it difficult to play, but also because there are better and more polished games out there that are worth playing. It's for that and other reasons why I don't recommend you give this game a try. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.